There is a photograph on the mantelpiece in our living room. My mother put it there herself, framed it herself, and dusted herself every single morning with a tenderness that I used to watch from the hallway when I was small, thinking, one day she will look at me like that. She never did. The photograph is of my older brother, Minjun, at his school graduation. He is grinning in that wide, easy way he has always had, the kind of smile that cost him nothing because the world has never asked him to pay for anything. He is dressed in his gown, his arm around my mother, and my mother is looking at him like he hung every star in the sky himself. Her eyes are soft. Her posture is loose and warm. She looks like a woman who has never once in her life been disappointed. I know that version of her exists. I have seen it. I have just never been the reason for it. My name is Jason Lee. I am 26 years old and I was born into a family of 4. My father, Lee Sungwon, my mother, Lee Mireille, my brother, Lee Minjun, and me. We live in Seoul in a house that is large enough to feel empty even when everyone is home. The neighborhood is good. The address is respectable. From the outside, we look like any ordinary Korean family that worked hard and earned their comfort. From the inside, from where I was standing, it looked rather different. I was the second child. The second son. And in every way that mattered, I was also the wrong one. People have always noticed me before I open my mouth. I know that sounds like vanity, but I say it with no particular pride. It is simply something I have spent my life learning to navigate, the way you learn to navigate a room with too much furniture. I am pale in the way that winter mornings are pale, my skin holding light without quite releasing it. My lips are pink without lipstick, curved in a way that strangers sometimes describe as delicate. My features are, I have heard this word used often, almost impossibly fine. High cheekbones. A jaw that tapers gently. Dark hair that falls across my forehead when I forget to push it back. And then there are my eyes. My eyes are the thing people cannot stop talking about, and they are also the thing I have spent the most time trying to hide. They change. Not gradually, not subtly, they change completely, shifting from color to color depending on what I am feeling, what I am thinking, what the world is doing to my heart at any given moment. When I am calm, they are a deep, still gray. When I am sad, they bleed into something blue and cold. When I am happy, genuinely, quietly happy, they turn a warm amber that my brother once described as looking like trapped sunlight. When I am angry, they go green, sharp and electric. I was born in Omega, which in our world carries its own weight, its own specific set of expectations and social furniture. In this world, alphas lead. Betas fill the middle. Omegas, we are the ones people either fight over or underestimate, sometimes both in the same breath. As a male Omega, I sat in a particular intersection of visibility and invisibility. People saw me constantly. They rarely bothered to truly look. My brother Minjun is also an Omega. This is important because my mother treated us as though we had come from entirely different species. Minjun is 29. He is gentle and good-natured, and I want to be clear, I do not blame him for any of it. He did not ask to be favored. He did not campaign for the warmth that was given to him and withheld from me. Minjun, if anything, spent years looking at me with a guilty helplessness that told me he saw what was happening and simply did not know what to do with that knowledge. He was raised soft. He did not know how to be brave. My mother, Lee Mireille, is a woman of considerable intelligence and considerable damage, and the terrible thing about people like her is that those two things rarely cancel each other out. They amplify each other instead. She was raised by parents who believed in perfection the way other people believe in religion. She was tested and competed and ranked and compared from the time she was old enough to hold a pencil. Every report card was a verdict. Every prize someone else won was a judgment on her character. And there had been one person, above all others, who beat her. I did not know his name for a long time. I only knew the effects of him, a shadow that had somehow fallen across my entire childhood without me ever understanding its source. He was a man who had, by my mother's account, stolen every first place, every honor, every recognition she had ever reached for. He had smiled while doing it. She described his smile to me once, not kindly, not as a memory shared but as a wound reopened, and I remember thinking even as a child, that she was describing someone who had simply been excellent at living. When I was born, I had the terrible misfortune of reminding her of him. My eyes changed color. So had his. My face was, she could not say it directly but I understood. My face looked like something that had no business being that effortless. When I won things, and I did win things because whatever combination of genetics and stubbornness I had been assembled from, it produced someone who was good at most things he attempted. It reminded her of watching him win. When I smiled, it landed somewhere in her memory that was tender and bruised and unhealed. She could not love me. I believe she tried in the very beginning. I believe there was a version of my early childhood where she looked at me and tried to feel what a mother is supposed to feel. But trauma has no interest in what we are supposed to feel, and whatever that man had cost her, I paid for it in installments every day of my life in that house. By the time I was 10, the lines were drawn clearly. Minjun sat at the table and was served first. Minjun's school events were attended. Minjun's friends were welcomed, fed, charmed. Minjun was kissed goodnight and told he was loved in the direct, uncomplicated way that children deserve. I cleaned the kitchen after dinner. I washed my own clothes from the time I was 12 because my mother would forget. Deliberately, I eventually understood, to include mine in the laundry. I cooked on weekends. I prepared meals and served them and cleaned up after them, and if I sat down at the table before everything was finished and everyone was comfortable, my mother would look at me with an expression that I can only describe as the absence of recognition, as though I were a piece of furniture that had decided to have opinions. Hello guys, welcome to Mimiel. Before we dive into this story, note this is an original work of Mimiel. If seen in another channel that is not Mimiel, please report that channel for impersonation and copyrights. Please don't forget to subscribe, comment, share and like for more stories like this. Now let's continue. My father. My father is the saddest part of this story in some ways because he was not a cruel man. He was simply an absent one. Not physically absent, he was there, at the table, in the living room watching television in the evenings. But he had trained himself, over years of living with my mother, to not see the things that would require him to act. He was a man who had learned to fold himself small around her moods, and in doing so, he had abandoned me to them entirely. I never hated him for it. I tried not to, anyway. Hating takes energy and I had learned early to spend mine carefully. What I had instead of hatred was reading. And running, sometimes when the house felt like it was pressing on my ribs. And a deeply private, deeply guarded inner life that I kept so carefully that not even Minjun knew the full shape of it. I was also, despite everything, or perhaps because of it, extraordinarily good at school. I did not do it to prove anything to my mother. I had stopped trying to prove things to her around age 13, when I finally accepted that no grade, no prize, no achievement would ever unlock the warmth she kept behind glass where I could see it but never touch it. I was good at school because learning was one of the only things that belonged entirely to me. In a classroom, no one could take credit for my answers. In a library, the books did not care whose son I was. I graduated at the top of my university class. My mother came to the ceremony and sat in the audience and watched it with an expression I could not read. On the way home, she spoke about Minjun's upcoming job interview. I pressed my face against the car window and watched Seoul slide past and told myself it did not matter. I had been telling myself that for 23 years at that point. I was getting very good at it. I want to tell you about the day I met Ian Kwong because it is the most important day of my life and I want to get it exactly right. It was January. The particular kind of January that Seoul does when it is serious about being cold. Not dramatic, not storming, just a steady, bone-settling chill that gets inside your coat and stays there. The sky was the flat white of old paper. The streets near the park were quiet because sensible people were inside. I had had a catastrophic morning. My mother had decided, in the way she decided things, suddenly without consultation, as though the world were a property she owned and the rest of us were tenants she could rearrange at will, that I was to repaint the utility room. Not because it needed repainting. Because she had seen a color in a magazine and thought it would look better. This was on a Saturday and I had been planning to spend the morning finishing a manuscript review I was doing freelance for a small publisher. Work I had not told her about because any money I earned she had a way of redirecting toward Minjun's various expenses, a habit I had only recently begun to resist. I painted the utility room. Then I cleaned the kitchen because she stood in the doorway while I was still putting away the paint supplies and announced, without looking at me, that the counters were not clean enough. Then she told me that Minjun's friend was coming for dinner and I needed to prepare enough food for guests, and when I pointed out that she hadn't mentioned this before, she looked at me with that particular expression. The one that was not quite contempt but was in the same neighborhood, and said, "I'm mentioning it now." I cooked. I set the table. I served. I cleaned up afterward while Minjun and his friend laughed in the living room and my mother refilled their glasses and smiled at them with a smile that cost her nothing. By the time it was over, I was so tired that I could feel the tiredness in the back of my eyes, in the hinges of my jaw, in the soles of my feet. I was tired in the particular way that has nothing to do with sleep and everything to do with being consistently, systematically unseen. I put on my coat. I picked up my book, a worn copy of a novel I had been carrying around for weeks, reading in stolen moments. I went outside. The park was 15 minutes from our house. I came here sometimes when I needed to breathe something that wasn't the air of that house. There was a bench near the center pond, half hidden by a large ginkgo tree that in winter looked like an architectural drawing of itself, bare, precise, somehow still beautiful. I sat there and opened my book and did not read a single word for a long time. I just breathed. The pond was half frozen. A few ducks sat at the edge of the ice with expressions of profound philosophical resignation. The cold was sharp enough to make my nose sting but not unpleasant. It felt honest the way very cold air always does. Nothing about that cold was performing anything. It was just exactly what it was. My eyes in those moments were gray. They are always gray when I am quiet inside. Not sad, not happy, just still. I had been sitting there for perhaps 20 minutes when I became aware that someone was looking at me. I know when I am being observed. I always have. It is the kind of awareness you develop when you grow up being noticed. But this was different from the usual quick double take on the subway or the lingering look in a coffee shop. This was sustained, deliberate, warm somehow even from a distance. I looked up from my book. He was standing on the path about 30 meters away, hands in the pockets of what was clearly an extraordinarily expensive coat, dark charcoal, perfectly cut, the kind of coat that exists only in the wardrobe of someone who has never had to worry about the price of things. He was tall, significantly tall. He had black hair pushed back from his forehead and a face that was, I remember thinking this clearly even in that first moment, the kind of face that looks like it was made with intention. He was looking directly at me. Not the quick, embarrassed glance of someone caught staring. He was looking at me with a steadiness that should have felt intrusive but somehow did not. There was something in his expression, open, genuinely surprised, almost wondering, that made it feel less like being observed and more like being discovered. Our eyes met. And then, because apparently his expression had not answered the question of what he would do next, he started walking toward me. My first instinct, built by years of being someone who avoided attention because attention in my house always preceded something being asked of me, was to look back at my book. But something stopped me. Some different instinct, newer and less guarded. I watched him come. He stopped a polite distance from the bench and said, in a voice that was deeper than I expected and surprisingly careful, "Is this seat taken?" The bench was the only one near the ginkgo tree. The park was nearly empty. It was January and we were both standing in the cold, and the question was obvious in its pretext, and yet, "No," I said. He sat down. Not immediately next to me, he left a respectful distance between us. He looked at the pond. He looked at the ducks. He did not immediately say anything, which I found inexplicably less alarming than if he had. After a moment he said, "Your book is upside down." I looked down. It was. I felt heat rise to my face, which I could not entirely blame the cold for. I wasn't reading it. I noticed. He turned his head and looked at me again with that same directness. Up close, his features were even more, there is no understated word for it, striking. He had dark eyes that held light the way still water holds light, and a jaw and a brow that gave his face a gravity that his expression, which was currently warm and slightly amused, was actively working against. "I'm Ian," he said. "Ian Kwong." "Jason," I said. "Jason Lee." He extended his hand and when I shook it, his grip was warm and solid and lasted exactly as long as it should. "You looked like you were thinking about something very far away," he said, settling back slightly. "I almost didn't come over. I didn't want to interrupt." "You did interrupt," I said, which was perhaps not the warmest thing I have ever said to a stranger. He smiled. It did not dim. "I know. But you were also sitting alone in January looking like the most beautiful thing I'd seen all year, and I thought, even if she decides she hates me for interrupting, at least I tried." The word beautiful landed somewhere in my chest with a weight I wasn't prepared for. Not because I hadn't heard it before, I had, in the hollow, performative way that people sometimes use it, aimed at my face without any particular care for what was behind it. But he said it with what I can only describe as simplicity. Like it was just a fact he was reporting. My eyes, I was aware, were probably no longer gray. "He," I said. "Not she." He blinked once. Then, with no flicker of discomfort, "My apologies." Even better. I looked back at the pond. One of the ducks had made a decision about the ice and was now regretting it. "What are you doing here?" I asked. "You don't look like someone who spends January afternoons in public parks." "I could say the same to you," he said. "I needed air," I said. "So did I." He was quiet for a moment. "Different kind, probably." My morning involved 3 meetings and a board presentation and a phone call from my father that lasted 45 minutes and accomplished approximately nothing. He said this without bitterness, just a kind of rueful acknowledgement. "I drive past this park sometimes. I've always meant to stop." I looked at him sideways. "And today you stopped." He looked back at me with that same steady, unhurried attention. "Today I saw a reason." We talked for 2 hours. I did not plan to. I had planned to sit in the cold for perhaps 30 minutes, let the silence reset me, and go home and eat something small and go to sleep. Instead, Ian Kwong sat beside me on a bench in January and asked questions and listened, genuinely listened with his whole attention in a way that I was not accustomed to, and 2 hours disappeared like water. He told me about his family company. The IK Group. I knew the name, Everyone in Korea knew the name, which his father had built from a mid-sized trading business into an empire that touched logistics, real estate, technology, and half a dozen other industries. Ian was the heir. He was 30 years old. He had spent his adult life preparing to take over something that had been built without him and that sometimes felt, he said with careful honesty, more like a weight than a gift. "Do you want it?" I asked. "The company?" He considered the question seriously, which I appreciated. "Parts of it. The problem is that wanting it comes attached to all the things I didn't choose." I understood that more than he knew. I did not say so, not yet. I only nodded. He asked about my work. I told him about the publishing work, the freelance editing and reviewing. I told him I had a degree in literature and a secondary qualification in graphic design and that I had been trying, carefully, to build something of my own. I did not tell him about my mother. Not yet. But he noticed something. He was, I would learn, extraordinarily observant in the way that people who have spent years in rooms full of complicated power dynamics tend to be. He had learned to read what was not being said. "You talk about your work like it belongs to you," he said. "You talk about everything else like you're describing a place you're visiting." I looked at him. "I don't mean it as a criticism," he said quickly. "It's just, I noticed." My eyes shifted. I could not have told you to what color, but I felt them shift. "You have remarkable eyes," he said softly, and it was not a deflection. He said it as though it were related to what he had just observed, as though he were making a note of it for later. We exchanged numbers. He walked me to the edge of the park, and when we said goodbye, he stood on the path and watched me go with that same steady, unhurried look, and I turned back once, unable to help it, and found him still watching. I went home. My mother asked where I had been, and when I said the park, she looked at me as though I had said something offensive and told me the bathroom upstairs needed cleaning. I cleaned the bathroom. Then I lay in my small room and looked at the ceiling and thought about a man who had sat beside me in January and said even better without a moment's hesitation. My phone buzzed. "Ian, I was going to wait a respectable amount of time to text. I've decided I don't want to." "Ian, I thought about our conversation the whole drive home. I'd like to have another one." I held the phone against my chest and felt something I had not felt in a very long time, something warm and tentative and fragile, like a match flame in an open window. I texted back, "Same time next Saturday?" The 3 dots appeared almost immediately. "Ian, try Tuesday. I'll come to you." He came on Tuesday, and Thursday, and the following Monday. And after 3 weeks of meeting in the park, and then in a coffee shop around the corner from the park, and then in a small restaurant where he knew the owner and where they gave us a corner table and left us alone, after all of that, it was no longer a question of whether we were becoming something. The only question was what to call it. He was unlike anyone I had ever known. He was powerful in the way of people who have never had to prove their power, which meant he never deployed it against people smaller than him. He was used to command, but he commanded quietly with attention and precision, not noise. He opened doors and held them without making it a performance. He remembered things I mentioned in passing, an author I loved, a place I said I'd always wanted to visit, a tea I preferred over coffee, and mentioned them again later, not showily, just in the way of someone who has genuinely been listening. He was an alpha. An unmistakably dominant alpha. I could sense it, that particular warmth and steadiness that radiates from a dominant alpha the way heat radiates from a fire. Not aggressive, not announcing itself, simply present and undeniable. As an omega, I was biologically susceptible to exactly that kind of presence, and I had spent most of my life being irritated by that susceptibility. With Ian, for the first time, I did not feel irritated by it. I felt safe, which was remarkable because I had not associated that word with another person since I was very small. "You're doing it again," he said to me one evening in late February over dinner. We were sharing a dish of japchae and I had gone quiet. "What am I doing?" "Going somewhere inside your head." He was not reproachful, just attentive. "Do you want to go there alone or can I come?" I looked at him across the candlelit table and decided for the first time to let someone in. I told him about my mother. Not all of it, not immediately, but enough. I told him about the laundry and the kitchen and the utility room and the graduation ceremony where she talked about Minjun's job interview on the way home. I told him about the photograph on the mantelpiece. I told him about having eyes that changed color and having spent most of my life wishing they wouldn't because every time my mother saw them shift, she looked at me with something that frightened me more than anger, a kind of blank, cold recognition as though she were seeing someone else entirely. Ian listened with the particular quality of attention that is not passive. It was active and I could feel it, the way he leaned forward slightly, the way his eyes never moved from my face, the way he did not interrupt or reassure or minimize. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he reached across the table and covered my hand with his. "Jason," he said, and the way he said my name was different from how other people said it. It sounded like something he was holding carefully. "What you're describing is not something children are supposed to endure. I know, I said. Do you? I looked at his hand over mine. I thought about that. Some days, I admitted. His jaw tightened just slightly. I would come to understand that this was how he expressed anger that he was containing for my sake. Not suppressing, just placing carefully so it did not fall on me. Then on the days you don't know it, he said quietly, will you let me remind you? My eyes, I think, went amber. He noticed. He looked at them with an expression so tender it made my throat ache. What does that color mean? He asked. Happy, I said. Or something close to it. He smiled then, slow and warm and absolutely certain. Good. The first time Ian kissed me it was late March. We had been at a gallery, a small one in Insadong, contemporary Korean artists, the kind of show neither of us had specifically planned to attend but ended up staying for 2 hours because we kept finding things to say to each other in front of the paintings. We were standing outside afterward in the cool spring dark, the street smelling of food stalls and old stone, and Ian had been saying something about a painting we had argued over, a large abstract piece in blue and white that I found beautiful and he found deliberately opaque, and I had been laughing, genuinely laughing, because his argument was both completely wrong and surprisingly well constructed. He stopped mid-sentence. What? I said, still smiling. He was looking at my eyes. They're gold, he said. I told you. Happy. He looked at me for one long moment in that unhurried way he had. Then he stepped closer and I did not step back and he raised one hand and cupped the side of my face, gently as though I were something that could be frightened away, and tilted my face up slightly. Can I? He said. The question was barely a sound. But he waited for my answer. Yes, I said. He kissed me. It was not a tentative kiss. It was not experimental or questioning. It was certain, the way Ian himself was certain, warm and deliberate and focused entirely on me, his mouth moving against mine with a care that managed to be both tender and unhurried. His hand stayed at my jaw, his thumb tracing the line of my cheekbone, and I felt myself lean into it, into him, without deciding to, the way a plant leans toward light. When he pulled back he did not go far. He stayed close, his forehead dropping to rest against mine, his breath slightly unsteady. I've been wanting to do that, he said low and quiet, since January. You waited long enough, I said. He laughed softly. I wanted you to trust me first. I closed my eyes. Behind them, something that had been wound tight for a very long time began carefully to loosen. I do, I said. Trust you. He kissed me again and this one was longer and the night around us disappeared completely. We kept our relationship private for a while, not hidden exactly but quiet. Contained to the spaces that belonged to us, the park, the restaurants, his apartment, which was large and calm and impeccably ordered and smelled like sandalwood and the particular clean scent of him that I had become, without meaning to, deeply familiar with. His apartment was the first place in my adult life that I associated entirely with comfort. No performance required. No expectations to meet before I was allowed to sit down. Ian cooked for me, not because he wanted to demonstrate anything but because he enjoyed it and wanted to feed me, which was such a simple and uncomplicated form of care that it broke something open in me the first time it happened. I sat on the counter while he cooked, which he seemed to find delightful. We talked. We argued about books and agreed about films and disagreed vehemently about music in a way that made us both laugh. He would reach across me for things without breaking his sentence. I would steal taste from whatever he was making. He would pretend to protest and then hand me the spoon. In those evenings my eyes were amber almost constantly. He told me one night that he loved my eyes more than anything. More than a billionaire's inheritance? I said. Significantly more, he said. The inheritance is complicated. Your eyes are just honest. I looked at him. He was standing at the stove, back half turned to me, and there was something in the line of his shoulders, broad, certain, at ease in a way he rarely was outside of this specific domestic space, that made my chest ache with a feeling I was only beginning to learn the name of. Ian, I said. I stopped, started again. I think this is the first time I felt like myself somewhere that wasn't alone. He turned from the stove. He looked at me for a long moment with something in his expression that was too large for his face to contain entirely. Then he crossed the kitchen in 3 steps, took my face in his hands, and kissed me with a thoroughness that tasted like the answer to everything I had not quite finished saying. The night we first became fully intimate with each other was in April, when the cherry trees in the park had just opened and the city was wearing its most deliberately beautiful face. We had come back from a long evening walk, the kind that starts with a direction and loses it gradually, until you are simply walking for the sake of walking together. In his apartment, the windows were open to the spring air. He lit a lamp rather than the overhead light, and the room was warm and dim and quiet. When he kissed me in the doorway, something shifted, an alteration in the quality of the evening, the way temperature changes when you step from one room into another. His kiss was slower than usual, deeper, and his hands moved to my waist and pulled me closer with a firmness that sent a particular kind of heat through me. "Jason," he said against my mouth. "I know," I said. "I want this." He pulled back to look at me, checking as he always did, in that way of his that made his alpha authority and his care for me completely inseparable from each other. My eyes were burning gold. He made a soft sound and kissed me again. He was extraordinary in the way that people are extraordinary when they bring their complete attention to something. He kissed along my jaw, the side of my neck, and where his mouth touched, I felt warmth bloom outward in concentric rings. His hands moved over me with care and intention, learning me the way you learn something you intend to know well for a long time. When he laid me down on the sheets, he looked at me in the lamplight with an expression so open that I felt briefly like I might come apart at the seams of it. "You are," he said quietly, "the most beautiful thing I have ever seen. Ian. I mean it. I need you to know that I mean it." He raised my hand and pressed his lips to the inside of my wrist, a small, deliberate act that undid me completely. What followed was, I do not have clean words for it. I have only the memory of his warmth above me and the careful way he moved, and the sound of the spring air through the open window, and the feeling of being held not as though I were fragile but as though I were precious, which is the difference between being handled and being cherished. His length was warm and certain against me, inside me, and when I gasped, he held me closer and moved with a rhythm that built slowly, beautifully, both of us losing the separateness of ourselves in increments until there was only the present moment and the warmth of him and the sound of our breathing entangled. Afterward, he held me against his chest and did not say anything for a long time. He only drew slow patterns on my back with the tips of his fingers, and I lay there listening to his heartbeat and felt, for the first time in my life, entirely arrived. "Stay," he said eventually quietly. "All right," I said. I stayed. I stayed that night and many nights after it, and each time felt like permission being renewed. 3 months into our relationship we stopped being quiet about it. Not dramatically, we simply stopped hiding it. We went to dinner in places where people knew Ian's face. We were photographed twice, which resulted in some social media speculation that neither of us addressed. His friends knew. A few colleagues of mine worked it out. We existed in each other's lives openly, and it felt like stepping out of a narrow hallway into a large room. It was Minjun who told my mother. I don't think he meant harm by it. I think he saw something at a family dinner, a message on my phone perhaps, or noticed I was going out more, and mentioned it to her later in that thoughtless, gentle way he had. Minjun operated on the assumption that information shared between family members was neutral, because in his experience of our family, it generally had been. My mother called me. She did not call to ask. She called to inform me that whatever I thought I was doing, I needed to stop it. She asked who the man was. I told her. I told her Ian Kwong. There was a silence on the phone that had a specific texture. Not empty but very full of things being suppressed. "Kwong," she said. "Yes." "Is his father Kwong Jae-hoon?" I had not thought to ask Ian his father's full name. I said I didn't know. Another silence. And then my mother said, in a voice I had not heard before, low and controlled and vibrating with something old, "Do not bring that man into this family, Jason." "I mean it." She hung up. I called Ian. "Does your father's name happen to be Kwong Jae-hoon?" I asked when he picked up. Pause. "Yes." "Why?" I sat down. "I think our parents know each other." The story came out over the following days in pieces. Ian's father and my mother had been academic rivals from middle school through university, a rivalry that had been genuine and sustained and profoundly formative for both of them, though it had clearly shaped them in very different ways. Kwong Jae-hoon had gone on to build an empire and to hold his achievements lightly, apparently. My mother had gone on to hold hers, and the losses, so tightly they had calcified into something that poisoned the air around her. The man who had beaten her to everything. The man whose smile reminded her of failure. That man's son was in love with her second son. The universe, I thought, has a sense of humor that I find largely unkind. The confrontation with my mother happened on a Sunday. She summoned me home, not asked, summoned, and when I arrived she was sitting in the formal living room with the posture of someone prepared for a disagreement they intend to win. "Sit down," she said. I sat. "You will end this relationship," she said. "I will not allow a Kwong into this family." I looked at her. My eyes, I was not trying to control them, were green. "No," I said. She stared at me. I think she was not accustomed with me to that word. Minjun didn't use it. My father certainly didn't. From me she had generally received compliance or at minimum silence. "No," she repeated. "No," I said again. "I won't. Jason. I am in love with Ian Kwong." It was the first time I had said it aloud, and the words felt enormous leaving my mouth, real in a way that things become real when you speak them. "I have been unhappy in this house my entire life, and you know that you are the reason," and I have never once in my adult years asked you to change any of it. I am asking you now very simply to not take this from me. My mother's face went through several things in rapid succession. I watched them pass. You will marry someone of my choosing, she said, and you will not marry before your brother. I am not going to do either of those things. You live under my roof. I don't, I said. I have my own apartment. This was something I had arranged 2 years ago, quietly, with my freelance income, partly because I needed the space to breathe and partly because some instinct had told me I would need the exit. I live there. I visit here. And I don't have to keep visiting. She stood. Her eyes were, and I know this will sound strange but I am trying to be honest, they were genuinely hurt. Not in the way that deserved sympathy in that moment, not the hurt of someone who loved me and feared losing me, but the hurt of a woman who found that her instrument had developed the capacity for resistance and did not know what to do with it. If you marry him, she said, I will disown you. You will not be my son. I stood as well. We faced each other. Then I won't be your son, I said. I left. In the car, I sat for a while before starting the engine. My hands were not shaking. That surprised me. I had imagined this moment many times, a moment of final confrontation, of line crossing, and in every version I had imagined I was shaking. But I was very still. My eyes, when I looked in the rearview mirror, were a shade I had not seen in a long time. Something between gray and gold. Calm, and underneath the calm, something that was distantly, quietly relieved. I drove to Ian's. Ian opened his door when I knocked, and when he saw my face, he did not ask what happened. He stepped aside and let me in and shut the door and then put both arms around me and held on. I stood in the circle of his arms and did not cry, but I pressed my face against his chest and let myself lean. Really lean. The kind of leaning that admits weight, that admits need, that says I am tired and I trust you with my tiredness. He held me for a long time. His chin rested on the top of my head. His arms did not loosen. Eventually I said, muffled against his shirt, she's going to disown me. I know, he said quietly. She called my father. I pulled back to look at him. What? Apparently they have a great deal to say to each other. He looked at me steadily. My father, for what it's worth, called to congratulate me. The corner of his mouth moved. He said, and I am quoting, is she still as terrifying as she was in university? Something involuntary moved through me, not quite a laugh but in the neighborhood. He remembers her, I said. He remembers her as the most formidable competitor he ever had, Ian said. He's been saying for 30 years that Mireille Kim was the only person who ever genuinely made him work for every single mark he got. Pause. He did not know she had been carrying it like this. I thought about that. About all the ways lives run parallel to each other, accumulating meanings they don't know they're accumulating. Ian, I said. I meant what I said to her. He looked at me. I am in love with you, I said. I should have said it to you first. I apologize for that particular sequencing. He was quiet for a moment, and then that smile of his arrived, the slow, certain one, the one that had undone me from the very beginning. I love you, he said. I have loved you since January. I have loved you since a bench by a frozen pond and a book held upside down. I put my hands on his face and kissed him, and it was different from every other kiss, fuller, freighted with everything that had just been said and decided, tasting faintly of the new shape of my life. Against my mouth he said, I want to marry you. I pulled back. Ian. I mean it. I've been meaning it for months. I was going to do it properly, dinner, a ring, something worth remembering, but I find I don't want to wait anymore. You have a ring? I have had a ring for 6 weeks, he said, with the expression of a man admitting something both embarrassing and entirely without regret. I looked at him. My eyes were gold. He looked at them and his expression went soft. You're happy, he said. I'm terrified, I said. And I'm happy. I think that's the same as yes. He went to the bedroom. He came back with a small box. The ring inside was simple, a pale gold band with a single inset stone that changed color slightly depending on the angle of the light. He had done that deliberately. I knew it without asking. He went down on one knee, which was not something I expected from Ian Kwong, who did everything with such economy of gesture, and the contrast of it, this powerful, contained man, on one knee in his apartment looking up at me with everything in his face, made my chest collapse entirely. Jason Lee, he said. Will you build something with me? Not will you be mine. Not will you marry me. Will you build something with me? Yes, I said. Yes. Get up. He laughed, bright and real, and stood and put the ring on my finger and kissed me with the warmth of someone who has just had something they wanted very much confirmed. That night, there was no park, no restaurant, no careful building toward anything. We came together with a directness that had no patience for preamble. Ian pulled me close in the doorway of his bedroom and kissed me with a hunger that was different from tenderness. It was present tense, it was immediate, it was the physical expression of everything that had been spoken and agreed to that evening. I felt it resonate through me, that pull, that warmth, the particular ache of wanting someone who wants you back with equal certainty. "Jason," he said low against my jaw. "Here?" I said. "I'm here." We undressed each other slowly, which was its own kind of communication. The unhurried quality of it, the way neither of us was rushing, as though we had all the time that had ever existed and were choosing to spend it here. He looked at me in the lamplight with an attention so focused it felt like being read, like being known completely and found entirely welcome. When he laid me down this time, it was different from the first time, less tentative, more certain, both of us more fluent in each other's particular language. He kissed down my throat, my collarbone, each of his lips' resting points a kind of annotation, a notation in the record of this night. I arched toward him without thinking. He made a low sound. "You are?" he started. "Don't stop," I said. He did not stop. His length was warm and slow and deliberate, and he watched my face throughout with a sustained attention that was both intensely intimate and almost unbearable in its specificity. He was cataloging me, memorizing this, and knowing that was its own particular undoing. I held on to him with both hands and let the building warmth rise, let it find its natural amplitude, let the night be exactly what it was. Afterward, he lay with his arm around me and his lips in my hair, and neither of us said anything for a long time. "We should plan a wedding," I said eventually to the ceiling. "Yes," he agreed. His chest moved with quiet laughter. "We probably should. Will your father come?" "Wild horses," Ian said, "could not stop my father." "Good," I said. I turned to face him. He looked at me in the dim room, at my face, at my eyes. "What color?" he asked. "What do you think?" He looked. He smiled. "Gold," he said. "Gold," I confirmed. He pressed his lips to my forehead and pulled me closer, and I closed my eyes and let the night settle around us like something earned. Planning a wedding is, I discovered, an exercise in learning which battles matter. Ian hired people for most of it, which I initially resisted and then came to appreciate deeply. His personal assistant, a formidably efficient woman named Park Soo-yeon who could apparently arrange a state dinner on 4 hours' notice, handled the venues and the caterers and the guest logistics. Ian and I handled everything that could only be decided by the two of us. What we wanted the evening to feel like, what we wanted to say to each other, what kind of beginning we wanted for this public version of our private life. Minjun called me 3 weeks after the dissownment. It was late on a Wednesday night, and I almost didn't answer because I was in the middle of a deadline and my mind was somewhere entirely else. But something made me pick up. "Jason," he said, and his voice he sounded like he had been trying to work up to calling for a while. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry. I didn't know she'd react like that. I didn't know." He stopped. "I've been thinking about things. About how things were. And I just..." "Minjun," I said. "I want to come to your wedding," he said. "If you'll have me." I thought about the photograph on the mantelpiece. I thought about a guilty, helpless look over the dinner table, sustained for 20-odd years. I thought about the fact that my brother had been made soft by the same woman who had made me careful, and that his softness was not cruelty, only limitation. "Of course I'll have you," I said. "You're my brother." He exhaled, a long shaky sound. "I'm going to do better," he said. "I want to be someone you can actually count on." "Start small," I told him. "Call me next week about something normal. Work up from there." He laughed, small and surprised. "Okay," he said. "Okay." My father called once, very briefly, to say he hoped I was well. He did not address the disownment. He did not address anything specific. It was the kind of call that carries an enormous amount of meaning in what it doesn't say. I told him I was well. I told him I was happy. He said that was good. We hung up. I sat with that call for a while. I decided it was enough. It was not what I might have wanted, but it was something, and at this point in my life I had learned to take something and put it in the correct size container. Ian's father took me to lunch the month before the wedding. Kwang Jae-hoon was in his late 50s, tall in the way Ian was tall, with a face that had clearly once been as striking as his son's and had now become something quieter and more settled. He had warm eyes and a handshake like a closing argument. "I owe you an apology," he said over the first course. I looked up. Not personally perhaps, but circumstantially. He turned his wine glass slowly. "Mireille was extraordinary, you know. I hope she knows that. I hope someone told her. The competition between us?" He shook his head. "It was never designed to be a wound. For me it was the most alive I ever felt academically. I'm sorry it landed differently on her." "She didn't tell you," I said, "that she had a son like me?" He looked at me with something careful in his expression. "No, she didn't." He paused. But I want you to know, whatever she carried, whatever it cost you, it was not because of anything wrong with you, Jason. It was her wound, not your fault. I looked at my plate. Something knotted behind my sternum. I know, I said. Most days. Yes, he said quietly. Most days is enough. We ate in companionable quiet after that, and I thought about the peculiar routes that lives take, how a rivalry between two brilliant, wounded people in a school classroom could ripple forward through decades and shape a child who was born long after the competition ended, and how that same child could find himself, 30 years later, having lunch with one of the rivals and finding it unexpectedly kind. Fate, I thought, is not subtle. But it occasionally gets the ending right. We married in October, when Seoul does its most beautiful thing, the maples turning their particular amber and red, the sky a deep, saturated blue, the air crisp and sweetly cold in a way that feels specific to that exact season. The venue was a place Ian had found in the hills outside the city, not enormous, not showy, but perfectly chosen. A low building of old stone surrounded by trees in full autumn color, with a long garden where the ceremony was held under natural light. There were perhaps 80 people. No press. No public announcement until after. I wore white, a suit, fitted and simple, with a collar that Ian had expressed, with the gravity of a man who has spent his life in boardrooms making important decisions, that he particularly liked. Minjun stood beside me. He was nervous, which was endearing. He kept adjusting his jacket and clearing his throat, and once, when the officiant arrived and we were arranging ourselves, he leaned over and said in a whisper, "You look, Jason, you look," and then appeared to run out of words and just shook his head. "Thank you," I whispered back. "I'm going to do better," he said again, like a promise he was making for the second time to ensure it held. "I know you are," I said. Ian was already there when I came down the garden path. He was standing at the end of it with his father beside him, and when he saw me, when our eyes met across the distance of those few meters of autumn garden, I watched something move through his face that was too large to be called just one thing. He was wearing charcoal. Of course he was. He looked like he was made for that suit and that moment and that particular quality of October light. I walked toward him. When I reached him, he took both my hands. He held them like that, both hands, both of mine and both of his, and said quietly enough that only I could hear, "You are the most extraordinary thing that has ever happened to me." "You're getting better at the timing," I said. He laughed, startled, bright and real, and it was that laugh that I will probably remember longest from that day, the sound of him in the October garden, laughing because I made him, because I can do that, because we do that for each other. We exchanged vows that we had written ourselves. His were careful and precise and specific. He listed things about me, things he had noticed and remembered, moments and details that proved he had been genuinely, consistently paying attention since January. Mine were, I had struggled with mine because I am better at editing other people's words than finding my own, but in the end I said, I spent most of my life learning to need very little because needing things that were not given was painful. You undid that, one careful gesture at a time. You made needing something feel safe. I will spend the rest of my life trying to be, for you, what you have been for me. Ian was quiet for a moment after I finished. Then he squeezed my hands once, twice, a private signal I didn't know we had until that moment. When they told us we could kiss, he cupped my face in both hands and kissed me the way he had kissed me in Insadong on that first night, certain and warm and entirely focused, as though the 80 people present were a detail and I was the point. The applause from the garden was warm. His father, in the front row, was wiping his eyes, which I found profoundly touching. Minjun, beside me, was also wiping his eyes and doing a poor job of hiding it, which I also found profoundly touching. The reception was everything I had not known to wish for, long and full of good food and better conversation, and Ian's hand at my back through most of it, steady and warm. We danced once, which neither of us did particularly well, and it did not matter at all. We talked to everyone and spent the last hour of the evening sitting with Kwang Jae-hoon and Park Soo-yeon and Minjun at a corner table, and it was the first time in my life that I sat at a table with family, chosen and biological, and felt nothing but easy. Late in the night, in the car on the way to the hotel where we would spend our wedding night, Ian looked at me across the dark back seat and said simply, "Hello, husband." "Hello," I said and felt it land, that word, that particular configuration of us, somewhere permanent and warm. A year after the wedding I published my first book. It was a small thing, a collection of essays on language and meaning and the particular kind of loss that comes from being chronically misread. Ian had encouraged me to pursue it, had read every draft with the same focused attention he brought to every board presentation, had pushed back when my instinct to minimize my own experience softened the edges too much. "Don't apologize for your perspective," he had said over and over. "Your perspective is the whole point." The book did moderately well. More than I had expected. I received a few messages from people who said they recognized themselves in it, which was the only form of success I had ever really wanted. My mother did not contact me after the wedding. I did not contact her. This was the arrangement we had arrived at, and while I cannot say it was without pain, because it was not, because there is a particular grief that attaches to the mother who could not be what you needed, even after you have stopped needing her, even after you have found everything you were looking for elsewhere, I could say that I had made peace with the shape of it. I held it carefully and put it in the correct size container and let myself have my life. My father sent a card on my birthday. Then another one the following year. Then Minjun told me he had begun to say things at home, small things, quiet things, that indicated he was thinking about what he had allowed. He did not call me. I did not call him. But Minjun was a bridge now, built of all the things he was trying to become, and I thought perhaps someday there would be enough of it to cross. Ian's work took us, that second year, between Seoul and Singapore and once to Paris, where we spent a week and where Ian bought me a first edition of a book I had mentioned loving, in a small shop near the Seine, paying an amount for it that I did not ask and he did not tell me, and presented it at dinner with the slightly self-satisfied expression of a man who has found exactly the right thing. "You are," I said, "completely ridiculous." "I know," he said. "Open it." Inside the cover, he had written something in his careful hand. "To the person who taught me that paying attention is the most important thing. All my attention always." And I put the book down. I looked at him across the Parisian dinner table. "Ian Kwong," I said. "Jason Lee Kwong," he said back with the satisfaction of someone who has been saying that combination of syllables and has not yet tired of it. "I love you," I said. "Overwhelmingly." "I know," he said. "Your eyes are gold." On a Sunday morning many months after the Paris trip, I woke early while Ian was still asleep. The light was coming in through the bedroom curtains in that particular way it does in early spring, filtered and soft and slightly golden. Ian was on his back with one arm extended toward where I had been, as though even in sleep he had reached for me. I lay there and looked at him for a while. He was exactly as beautiful as the day I met him. More in some ways because I knew the whole of the face now, the lines around his eyes when he laughed, the set of his jaw when he was thinking, the particular softness that came over him in the mornings before he was entirely awake. I thought about January. About a park and a frozen pond and a book held upside down and a stranger who asked to sit down and then turned into the whole shape of my future. I thought about my mother and all the ways that damage moves through generations like water moving through rock, and I thought about the choice I had made, was continuing to make, to let it stop with me. Not to pass it forward. Not to love anything with the cold, competitive energy of someone who was never allowed to just be. I thought about the boy I had been, the one who cleaned the kitchen and cooked the meals and washed his own clothes and stood at the mantelpiece looking at a photograph and telling himself it didn't matter. I thought about how that boy had somehow, despite everything, kept his eyes open, kept them changing color, kept some part of himself alive and honest and capable of receiving something good when it eventually arrived. I was glad he had. I was glad that boy had been stubborn enough to survive. Ian's eyes opened. He found me immediately, he always did, and his expression shifted from the blankness of just woken to something warm and specific. "Morning," he said, voice low and still weighted with sleep. "Good morning," I said. He turned toward me. He looked at my eyes. "Gray," he said. "But not sad gray." "No," I said. "Just thinking gray." "What are you thinking about?" I moved closer to him and he put his arm around me, and I tucked my face against the warm curve of his neck. "January," I said. "A bench. A man who sat down without being asked." He made a low sound. "The best decision I ever made." "You sat down?" I said. "I let you." "I know." He pressed his lips to my temple. "Equal credit." I smiled against his neck. Outside, the spring morning was doing what spring mornings do, filling with light, filling with sound, birds and distant traffic and the specific quiet busyness of the world beginning again. My eyes, when I closed them, were the color of something that has finally, after a long and complicated journey, arrived exactly where it was supposed to be. Ember. Gold. Warm as the sun coming through a curtain. Happy.